Hi Supriya, I've sent you the. Yes. We're just connecting to Supriya. Hi Supriya, how are you?
Quite well, thanks. Nice to see you.
Yes, same here. Must be very early in the morning for you.
Not so early, not so early, yeah.
So I'm so glad and happy that you came here because you've been doing so many interviews, and I thought, like I must have one with you also, another one.
Well, you've been so tireless in just hosting a range of things. You're really holding up, anything to do with the Mughals, Indo-Muslim culture.
I feel very essential in these days to keep putting out information there. The information should be there on the internet or online so that people can refer to it, because there's so much of rewriting being done, so much of WhatsApp history being promoted, that I feel it's very important to engage with genuine scholars and put out a correct version out there. If not today, at least someone will hear it someday.
Absolutely. I mean, that's something I really value, the ability to just engage with people in India who are interested in these issues, of course.
So I think we've got quite a lot of people. I'll just quickly introduce Supriya, though she does not need any introduction. She is a historian of Mughal India and senior lecturer in religious studies at Yale University. She grew up in India. You studied in St. Stephen's, isn't it?
I went to St. Stephen's, yes.
Yes. And she received her PhD from Harvard University and also has studied in Iran and Syria. She is a recipient of fellowships from the Fulbright and Mellon Foundations. And this is the book on which we'll be talking, The Emperor That Never Was. But we won't be talking about his imperial ambitions. We'll be talking about another very softer aspect of his life, because normally we talk about about the death, about how he was
Uh,
defeated, and his Sufism, or maybe his rivalry with Aurangzeb. But today we'll talk about the feminine influences in his life. And the first question I'd like to ask you, Supriya, is that we keep hearing so much about his relationship with Jahanara. We hear about Shah Jahan's grief when Mumtaz Mahal died, but Dara was also present there. He was also present in Burhanpur in 1631 when she passed away. And coincidentally, it was just 2 days ago that it was Mumtaz Mahal's, or yesterday, I think, in fact, was Mumtaz Mahal's death anniversary. So Dara was there. How did Mumtaz Mahal's death affect Dara? How did the separation between the mother and the son affect him when they were quite young and sent as hostages to Jahangir's court? And what was the effect and the influence of Mumtaz Mahal on her son?
Wonderful. So thank you for asking this question about Dara Shukoh's mother. Um, so I'm just going to make a general point about our topic and focus on women. And then I'm going to be speaking a little bit about Arjuman Banu Begum, as he was called before Shah Jahan became the throne, uh, and Mumtaz. So one of my aims in this book was to write a biography that wasn't just a conventional story of a great man. So one way I tried to do that was by also integrating the stories of Mughal women who actually played a very important role in politics, in negotiations with the aristocracy and a whole range of other people, petitioners and so on. So they had important political roles, they had important roles in the Mughal household, and many of them also cultivated spiritual and intellectual interests. And yet, because the Mughal chronicles don't tell us a whole lot about them, except in certain cases, we really need to read between the lines and sort of piece together their history. So that's what one has to do with Dara Shukoh. We have to think of his relationship with his mother. We can try to put uh, ourselves in the position of imagining what it might have been like for Arjuman to have given birth to Dara Shukoh. She had two other children by then. She had a daughter called Hurun Nisa, uh, two daughters. And she was married to the third son of the reigning emperor. So her future was uncertain. Her aunt, her paternal aunt, Nur Jahan, was also was Jahanar's consort and as Rubilah, his co-ruler. Her father had a very important role in the court as well. She was very well connected, but her future was certainly not assured. Neither was the future of her. Okay, so some people are talking about the poor connection.
I think you can just come a little closer. I am using earphones, so I am not having that problem. But maybe you can come a little closer.
Yes. So to be an aristocratic Mughal woman was...
I think now you're clear. Now it's clear.
Okay.
It's clear. See, Supriya is a very soft-spoken person, so she's not going to shout anyway. So we have to.
Yeah, I have to be sure to make myself speak louder. So, so though she came from certainly a very, very privileged context, the future was not at all assured. So some of Dara Shukoh's fairly early memories would have been just traveling, constantly traveling with his parents. What we know of Arjuman Bano is that she was always by Raja. They were always traveling together. He had various military campaigns and responsibilities, either following his father or engaging in these campaigns by himself. So her life, like the lives of Mughal royals, was always peripatetic. I'm sure they had loads of servants with tents, palatial tents erected for them. The women tended to travel in palanquins. The men tended to travel on horses. But it was still pretty grueling. And so this is her life when she was pregnant, giving birth to children, traveling with small children, like this. It wasn't just a cloistered sort of life in one kind of color. And, one of the tragedies in her life was, of course, the death of her firstborn, Nisa, which also brought Dara and so the children certainly saw a lot of their mother, and I think as the eldest surviving children, they would have had a great deal of time for her, and a special with her. Then the whole family went through a period of adversity that also might have helped this bond with them. And this is when Shah Jahan becomes the rebel, that he falls out of favor with his son. He defies him. He's in Burhanpur, and Shah Jahan at this point has other wives as well. There is this ideal of sort of monogamous conjugal love that we see expressed. And by this time, there is the sentiment of conjugal love. We see that with Jahangir and Nur Jahan. We see that in the later chronicles after Mumtaz death, extolling the love between Shah and his wife. We forget that he actually had other wives. He had at least two other wives whom he. Dara Shukoh's mother is negotiating, of course, just the broader family dynamics, relationships between these other. We get the sense that she also has a hand in sending messages and negotiating relationships with the various staff, whether it's military commanders or other people in the throughout. So they're constantly traveling through very difficult circumstances, and often with fairly little hope. They try to go all the way from Burhanpur to Harem. Then they flee to Udaipur, where they take shelter with the Raja Karan Singh over there. whose father actually, Khurram, had actually killed. Then they keep traveling. They go south again. Then they go east, and all this while, Arjumand is also pregnant with Murad, who gets born in the east when Khurram has to, to control a little bit of territory and form a base from which to sort of take out his rebel activities. And she is constantly involved. We get little glimpses of this through the Jahangir through Jahangir's own memoir, when he talks about how Khurram's wives were like, inviting Abdul Rahim Khan Khanan, who's kind of wavering, deciding, to join Khurram, to stay with the emperor, and they invite him into the harem with their children and their in there too, and they just weep and they beg him to support him, and he eventually does. But we can see the important role that these women play. We also get some more intimate domestic glimpses from a certain Shitab Khan, known as Mirza Nathan, who wrote the Baharistani Ghairbi, which is a chronicle of this nobleman, sort of on the frontiers of the empire, who is trying to negotiate his loyalty to the reigning emperor Jahangir, as well as also playing up his closeness to Khurram. So he. Okay, the voice is still cutting off. Okay, yes, I'm sorry. I'm sorry about this connection. I hope it gets a bit better. If there's anything else that I can do, to give suggestions. So just to go back to Arjuman Bano, and okay, so it's still getting cut off?
Not now. Not now. It's better now. It's better now.
Yeah. Sorry about kind of come closer.
Yes.
Okay, good. And try to come even closer. Okay. Generally, it's pretty good. I'm not sure what the issue is. So Arjun Bano is she's giving directions to Shitab Khan. They're deciding what to do. Of course, children too play a role in this. They're even considering whether to use Aurangzeb as a pawn, as a kind of hostage to secure their position in Bengal with a governor there, Ibrahim Khan. Eventually, they decide against that because they managed to kill Ibrahim Khan. So she's constantly being involved in these political dynamics. Also, again, this is something that Dara Shukoh would have witnessed very closely. And then his brother Murad is born, and so on. Their fortunes look as though they're going to be on the upswing, and then again they take a downward turn. And his father actually had to seek forgiveness and deposit his two sons, his eldest sons, Dara Shukoh and Aurangzeb, as hostages at the court. The reason why Shuja is not being included over here is because Shuja was already with Nur Jahan and Jahan. The couple had taken a liking to Shuja. Jahangir doted upon him as his favorite grandchild, so they just adopted him and raised him on their own. And here we don't see what Arjuman Banu's reaction was when one of her children was taken away to be reared by her aunt, with whom she. Of whose intentions she would never have been completely sure. So all of these are things that as a Mughal woman she had to negotiate. The duty of procreation, and then negotiating these relationships that involved her children, and that involved the wider world. It wasn't purely domestic at all. So for Dara Shukoh, the relationship wasn't, purely one that was domestic, that was the individual mother and son relationship. It was embedded in a web of so many others. and there were many such factors. And then, yes, it must have been a trying time for the young Dara and Aurangzeb to go. And again, we know that they were sent as hostages. We can see the timing of when they arrived, because they arrived right when Mahabat Khan's coup was happening. The general, I think you've already discussed this in your conversation with me.
Yes, Ruby, yes.
Which was quite a momentous time when both the emperor and Nur Jahan were kind of held captive, and eventually they managed to take Mahabat Khan off. So this is the situation that the two brothers arrived in, and they had no idea when this was going to end or how it was going to end. And indeed, after Shah Jahan acceded to the throne, there was a very bloody end for any competitor for all the young Mughal princes who were around, including Dara Shukohs, many cousins. So all of these sort of difficult and rather gruesome things too would have had to be been negotiated and faced by the Mughal women of the time.
And did Mumtaz Mahal's death make Dara more spiritually inclined, or he was already spiritually inclined from before?
So it's a little hard to say what Dara's spiritual inclinations were before he starts writing about them and before he meets the Qadari order of Myanmar and Mullah.
Okay, in Kashmir. That is later.
So that's a bit later. That's after he gets married. So it's, but we do get a sense of the emperor's great grief at his mother's death, which also must have been shared by the two.
You've talked about it. You've talked about this in your book, that even Dara does go to that grave in Burhanpur, the temporary coffin that was there. So you've discussed that in the book, and of course Shah Jahan's grief is well known, and even I've talked a lot about it in relationship to Burhanpur. So and Dara is pretty young when he starts getting that what is known today as the Dara Shukoh album painted. When he starts getting that Murakka done, he's pretty young, and in that we have a lot of portraits of women, which you've also described in your book. Now these, I was just going through these portraits, though they of course are very generic. The faces are generic, as the Professor Kavita Singh called them, Choro Panchasika style. Choro Panchasika style, where they all have, they may be wearing different clothes and in different, standing in different movements, but they all have the same face, same figure, everything. So that is the sense I get even when I see Jahanara or even Noor Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal, they all look the same. It can't just be family resemblance. And yet he gets so many of them painted. And if you don't look at the face, there's so much of tenderness in that, the luminosity of the portraits, the tenderness with which they are portrayed. So do you think that Dara was, going away from the patriarchal mindset of that time, and there was something a little softer in him, which may have also, been his spiritual inclinations?
So so there are a number of things sort of going on with this. So for a long time, Dara Shukoh's album was thought to have been completed in the 1640s, and earlier there was a date that was considered to be the date of the album, kind of in the early 1600s. And he has an inscription on the album to his wife, and I'll be speaking about that in a bit. That was then redated, based on kind of newer technologies, dating by the art historian John Tyler to around 1646-47. So that's the date of the inscription when he gifts the album to his wife. Now, on a stylistic basis, the art historian Jeremiah Losty has argued that it should really be dated to his time in Burhanpur in the early 1630s. So his father has become emperor. He has he's recently lost his mother, and he's doing what princes do in a privileged position. Aurangzeb also might have done this. There are some rumors of an album attributed to Aurangzeb also, where he raids his father's kind of collection of calligraphies and various other pieces from the past. He also commissions artists to create images, a whole range of images. Some of them are images of nature, flowers, birds, etc. Others are of women. There's often the theme of the prince sitting with his tutor also. So, so women do play an important role in his album, and it is true that in general, Mughal representations of women, unlike the representations of men, seem to have been more idealized because they were not based on live sitters. So with the men in Shah Jahan's court, you can see in a court scene that everyone has kind of the details of their faces, their appearances, sort of sketched out very clearly, except the emperor, who's sort of luminous and above all of that. But with the women, if a male artist was not, actually painting directly from a woman, it's hard to say. At the same time, there is a tradition of different portraits of women. We know that Nur Jahan was depicted in a number of paintings. So I think we can definitely say that we can only guess what Dara Shukoh might have been doing with the album as he was putting it together as a young prince. We might guess that after his mother's death, it might have provided him some comfort. But again, it's speculation. We don't sort of have hard proof of that. We do know that he gives it to his wife with the most loving inscription, and we can probably guess because the later painting that he commissions in the 1640s is so different after his initiation into the Qadri order. We can guess that this was a prized treasure from his early days, and then he gives it to his wife at an appropriate time, much later on.
Maybe that is why, I suppose, as a gift to his wife, is why it had, there's, as I said, there's a luminosity and a tenderness in that album, which we don't normally get. And Jahanaras, the painting that's normally said to be Jahanara of her standing near a tree, that is also part of this album. And that's a very famous painting that we keep seeing whenever anyone who Googles Jahanara, the first thing they'll see is that painting of her.
Right. Yes.
Isn't it? It is a beautiful painting.
It is. Now, it's not labeled in the way that some other are labeled.
As I said, the one that is said to be hers, because none of them are named. And very soon after, of course, Mumtaz Mahal is said to have arranged the wedding of Nadira Begum with Dara Shukoh, but the marriage doesn't take place in her life. It takes place later. Jahanara arranges it, and there are so many beautiful portraits of that wedding procession. One of them here in the National Museum. So what role does Nadira Begum play in his life? Is she an intellectual companion to him, like Jahanara is? Or is it just a purely emotional relationship? And what influence would she have had on him? Because she was there with him right till the end. When she dies, I think just a little before he's captured.
Yeah. So, unlike Jahanara, who herself wrote a lot, in the case of Nadira Banu, we don't have lots of her own writing. We do have little kind of, again, snippets of information that we can put together. So, for instance, in Dara Shukoh's album Inscription that he pens in the 1640s, he calls her his companion, his Anis, a special companion, Anis-e-Khan. He calls her his Hamdam, is someone whose breath is the same as his, so really, really intimate companion, and his Hamraz, someone who shares secrets with him. So these are really kind of beautiful and very intimate terms with which to refer to a wife. So he's not viewing her, merely as kind of a receptacle to produce future children, or someone, whose role is just, sort of minimal in his life. He's giving her, he's really describing her role as a very special companion, as a friend. So he's talking about this marriage bond as one of companionship and friendship. And we've seen that with Jahangir and Noor Jahan. Also, we've also seen a discrediting in Shah Jahan's time of Noor Jahan's role and influence on the court. But this ideal of conjugal love still exists. It continued in the way Shah Jahan's and Mumtaz Mahal's relationship was described in chronicles, for instance, in the chronicle Bachanama of Qazvini, and then of course we see this in Dara Shukoh's own words repeated. So the time that we actually see and hear more about Nadara is at the time of greatest crisis in their life, when Dara Shukoh is he is fighting to get the throne. He is also escaping on the run and trying to sort of rustle up an army so that he can fight back. But before that, again, there are these little snippets. So in the early 1650s, when Dara Shukoh is charged with the mission to Kandahar, and he has to deal with Rajput generals and noblemen who are exhausted. They've done this twice before. They don't really want to go again. And we have this little nishan, this little decree from Nadara Bano to Mirza Raja Jai Singh, who is one of the most powerful Rajput nobles. And she says, well, no, you don't really need to kind of come and attend on me. Like, just go ahead to Kandahar. Just do what you're doing. So again, we can only infer, because we don't have full exchange, we don't have the full context of this. There are other similar decrees where Jahanara is also encouraging the Raja to do his job. So we can infer that perhaps he was reluctant. He has a history later on also of being very reluctant to listen to the orders of Dara Shukoh, and that these royal women are roped into the task of pressing him to do their job. So Nadara too would have played a diplomatic role. Dara Shukoh was given a lot of power and leeway by his father, and Nadara also would have played a diplomatic role. It's not, she wasn't completely cloistered in a harem with no contact with the other powerful figures of the time, including male figures. Later on, when they are both fleeing for their lives, Nadara does a whole range of things. She, in fact, there's this one incident when she is trying to enlist this Raja Rajru, who turns out to be a dodgy character, at least when it comes to support the but he says, I'll give you an army and all of that. And he literally makes him into a son. This is described by Minucci, but it's fairly believable. This is the idea. So this relates to the idea of kinship, of milk kinship. So one way in which Mughal women created bonds and networks of support for the male members of their family was by establishing ties through milk, kinship ties through milk, or the idea of milk, based on various Quranic references that cite a similarity between blood and milk when it comes to relationships. Now, for Mughal royals, blood relationships didn't necessarily mean much. Your brother could kill you, you could be out to kill your brother. But to have a milk relationship with someone, that is, if a child was nursed with the same milk as another child, they would then become milk siblings, milk brothers or milk. Or so this is what Arjuman would have done to create a whole foster family of milk relations for all her children. And this is what Nadra does. So she actually sort of does a symbolic act of making Rajput, into a kind of milk king, and it fails. But it's a dramatic instance of of again the extent to which she can go to forge ties and gather support.
And from what I've understood, it was a pretty monogamous relationship. He did not have any other wife.
There are references to other wives. Again, because Dara Shukoh never became emperor, so his family is not chronicled as much as Shah Jahan's family. The chronicles do talk about Kandahari Mahal, for instance, and the wives of Shah. But in actually, there are references to when he's fleeing, that he flees with his 3 wives.
Oh, there is. And there's this beautiful painting in National Museum, which I often go and see, of Dara Shukoh sitting with Rana Dil. So who was this Rana Dil? And what was the relationship? Are there any references, or this is just a poetic imagination, a painter's imagination?
Well, it may not be, it might well be an imagination based in fact. There's more than one painting of Dara Shukoh with a beloved, whether another wife or a concubine or, someone he later married. So this idea of conjugal love was premised on, of course, monogamy on the wife's side, but not necessarily on the...
That's very typical.
It is typical. Now, it doesn't mean that, Dara Shukoh sort of elevated his relationship with Nadra. He certainly did. He would have done that. The chronicles do that at least. But there were references to a whole range of concubines, and that's something that I didn't discuss because I couldn't find anything definitive. So there's Rana Dil, of course. There's the painting in the National Museum. The British Library has a painting of a Mughal woman that seems to be kind of 17th century, looks like it's from the 17th century, of someone called Gul Safa. The Gul Safa who was the beloved of Dara Shukoh. So Rana Dil and Gul Safa, the same Rana Dil and Gul Safa, different beloveds of Dara Shukoh. And then, there are later stories of Udaipuri Mahal, who was Dara Shukoh's concubine, whom Aurangzeb coveted. And so when you get into the later 17th century and the 18th century and the European sources, there's just there are a whole range of stories. They're not necessarily verifiable, so that's why I would be a little cautious about those, because European travel tended to be obsessed with the harem, obsessed with the women's quarters that were completely inaccessible to them, so they were all these stories that they got from informants. They were also writing these stories to be consumed back in Europe, where also there was an obsession with kind of forbidden harem, and whether it's in the Ottoman case or other cases.
Stories, of course. Yes, please continue.
No, so I heard there's this gentleman in Lahore, a descendant of an architect during Shah Jahan's time, Lutfullah Mohandas, who was also a literature, who wrote a divan. And it's not easy to actually lay one's hands on the Diwani Mohandas. And, I did hear from him that this divan has a poem that he thinks might have been addressed to one of Dara Shukoh's concubines, Gul Safa. But, it's hard to say. These divans can be in very generic terms. They might be, and it's not, if it's not, there isn't a specific reference. Again, it's very hard. It's hard to say, and I haven't been able to actually lay my hands on that and see whether I find this particularly convincing.
So as you said, of course, it's very important to see the actual sources and then talk about them. But stories about the Mughal, especially Shah Jahan's children, abound. So, in your book, you mentioned that when Dara Shukoh is executed, there was a rumor that it was done at the insistence of Roshanara. So, what was the relationship between Roshanara and Dara Shukoh? Why was it so bad that it led to such speculation?
So now again, this is a story that we get from European sources.
Yes. So it must be based on some kind of speculation. So just talk us through this relationship.
So there is this idea that each of these three main prominent daughters of Shah Jahan, Jahanara, Roshanara, and Gauhara, that they each allied themselves with a different Mughal prince. So Jahanara allied herself with, in this narrative, with Dara, Gauhara with Murad Bakhsh, and Roshanara with Aurangzeb. Now, even if there might be a kernel of truth to this, it's heavily oversimplified. Because we know that Jahanara had a very close relationship with Aurangzeb also, in fact, with all of her brothers. That she really took on the role of kind of family consultant and peacemaker. After her mother died, she had an important role to play. She arranged their marriages. She played a very important role in their life. And there are letters that Aurangzeb wrote to her, replies to letters that she wrote to him. In fact, she would often write more letters to him. He was, being sort of maybe a typical brother, would ignore them or apologize for being late in his replies. But so one can't really say that there were these different factions of Mughals, so these Mughal sisters.
I'm sorry, I'm laughing at this message that somebody has just suddenly put from nowhere of Prem Vivah and, call some number for any relation. I don't know what about our conversation has triggered this, but I was just laughing at that.
So it might be the case that, again, that there was some enmity between Roshanara and Jahanara, that she just decided to support, whom she thought was going to be the ruler for her own well-being and security. And that's something that Jahanara did too. I mean, she made her peace with Dara Shukoh's rulership, even though she did her best to thwart bloodshed between the brothers. So there was a question from Mughal ideology.
He hasn't asked the question as yet. This Mughal, this is a young boy. He's 14 years old, Danish. Danish, our conversation is not on jizya and these things. So, if you have a question related to our topic, please do ask. I'm sure Professor Gandhi would love to answer. Okay. So, to come back to the Dara Shukoh and his relationships, I'll talk about Jahanara. That will be the last, and then I'll open it out for people to ask questions. I'd like to talk about his daughters. We do know about Jani Begum, and you have talked about one princess whose name actually is the first time I've heard, Pakni Hath, who is crying and pleading to the person who's capturing him, saying, "Take my life and leave my father alone." So, can you just talk about the daughters and what was his relationship with his daughters? And Sajjad, we'll take your question after this.
Great. So we actually don't know a whole lot about his relationship with his daughters. So this particular description of Paknihad Begum, his eldest daughter, trying and really pleading with great courage for the life of her father to be spared, we know this from the poetic imagination of Mullah Beheshti Shira, who was an eyewitness to the events around the War of Succession, which he then compiled into a versified poem, Ashobe. So we have this from the pen of Mullah Beheshti, but it could be that he just sort of took poetic license. He might have heard about something like this, and he took poetic license to sort of put these words into her mouth. So that's really one of the few things we know. We know a lot about his sons because his eldest son, Suleiman Shukoh, had a lot of responsibilities, also elevated in Shah court. But with this, I'm just reading my English translation. Bring me with countless golds and jewels into the train of maidservants into your kitchen. My mother is the daughter of Pervez Shah. My father is Temur's descendant, possessor of glory. Exhibit me to the world in the position of a maidservant. Release the fetters from Dara's legs. So she's willing to sort of sacrifice everything to spare her father. That's one of the few mentions that we have.
So I think we've talked quite a bit about Jahanara. You've talked in all your various conversations that you've had in these 3-4 months, even before. You've talked a lot about Jahanara, so we'll give it a miss today, and we'll take the questions. There's this question: what do we know about the Sufi affiliations of these women? That's apart from Jahanara, I should suppose.
Yeah, so I have talked about Jahanara in other sort of fora, but so I don't need to go into sort of great detail. But I could repeat a couple of things here.
Yes, please. So that we can take the questions after that.
Yeah. So
Supriya, I think you'll have to talk a little bit louder again.
So in Jahanara's case, we do know about her Sufi affiliations because she writes about them very called in her spiritual autobiography, Risale-e-Sahibiya. She also writes a Sufi collection of Chishti Sufi biographies called the Munasul Arwa. So we know that she was very devout towards the Chishtis, and she also was affiliated to the Qadri order and had a kind of a living teacher in Mullah Shah Badakhsh. In terms of other Mughal women, there are glimpses that Jahanara was not utterly unique in doing so. For instance, we know that the Naqshbandis sent a lot of letters and missives to Mughal royals as well as Mughal aristocrats. So we know that Muhammad Masoom, the son of Sheikh Ahmed Sirhindi, wrote such letters, and one of these letters was to Janan Begum, who's a noblewoman. She's the daughter of Abdur Rahim Khan Khanan. She is also married to Jahangir's brother Danial. So she's an important Mughal noblewoman, and Muhammad Masoom is writing to her. So he might have may have just chosen her randomly, or we can assume that he had an interest in Islamic mysticism that she was developing through correspondence with notable Sufi figures. It could be that by plumbing these Naqshbandi letters, of which we have a lot, we can reconstruct the letters addressed to Mughal women, and then perhaps glean from that a better sense of Mughal women's formal association with Sufi activities and just with the whole intellectual world of
That's interesting. And there's one question from Manu Pillai. He says, on sources other than European, Sanskrit and Persian, is there anything on Dara in Hindi sources, Bengali or other regional languages? Did his story trickle down into less courtly spaces?
Absolutely. So there is both a visual tradition as well as a literary tradition. In terms of Braj Bhasha sources, yes, there are a number of them, especially later ones that talk about the War of Succession. Yes, and Bengali is not, again, that's not something I've plumbed a whole lot. But Hindavi sources, absolutely, including Hindavi sources of his time. The Kavindacharya Saraswati, who wrote in both Braj Bhasha and Sanskrit, had odes dedicated to Murad, to Dara, and many members of the imperial family.
Danish has one question. Why was Jahanara called as Basha Begum? Because the title was given only to the emperor's wife. Can you just talk of the institution of Basha Begum? Who was given that title and how was it given?
So in some of the contemporary sources, she's known as Sahib, actually, or Begum Sahiba or Sahib. That's how her brother refers to her. That's also how some of her Sufi contemporaries refer to her.
Did Dara Shukoh wish to be buried next to Nadra? That's Mani's question.
It's I would not be surprised. I would not be surprised because he makes sure that when she passes away, that she is buried near Myanmar. And I have a feeling that he would want his own mausoleum to be in that kind of axis. And no doubt there'd be all kinds of sort of esoteric symbolism, with regard to the positioning of the tombs and so on. So that would be my guess.
Okay. So there's a message here which I think you can read. I'm a direct descendant of Maulvi Noor Ahmad Chishti. He was my mother's great-grandfather. He wrote Tehqiqat-e Chishti. So all of this is wonderfully intriguing.
Thank you so much.
And there are messages for you that loved your book. Now, Ali Nasir has a question. Dara Shukoh is described as being spiritual, pluralist, and generous. Was he the antithesis of Aurangzeb, or is it far-fetched? Do we want to talk about Aurangzeb today?
I guess we can't really avoid it.
Because I had wanted to avoid all conversation related to Aurangzeb and the War of Succession, but it's up to you.
Well, if that's a question, sure. So Dara Shukoh was definitely intellectually curious and intellectually generous and hospitable with regard to what he wanted to, his engagement with and his absorption of ideas from Indic thought. So he was not unique in doing so. He was following a broader Mughal tradition. With Aurangzeb, there are things that, yes, in some cases, when he's courting Rajput rulers, for instance, he says, I want to follow in the footsteps of my great forefathers and also, enable people of different religions to live in peace. So Aurangzeb has that side to him, whether using it pragmatically. Again, so I would say that they represent perhaps, sort of the different positions on a spectrum rather than being totally, one the antithesis that we are.
Just tell us a little more about Jahanara. Since we have time, we've got another 10 minutes. So, and that was, I had kept her for the last. And I thought in case there are any questions, we can, but so the very, very special relationship that there is between Jahanara and Dara Shukoh, you've talked about it. So can we just, take us through, the listeners who are here today may not have heard about it.
Yeah. So, why don't I actually just read a passage from her spiritual autobiography, The Sahibiya, where she talks about this relationship. So this is a translation of a passage when she talks about a relationship with her brother. So this is the English translation. For my brother, Sultan Muhammad Dara Shukoh, victorious, powerful, Gnostic of secrets, master of spiritual experience and divine presence, the eye's light and light's vision, possessor of inner meaning and glorious deeds, heir to the inner and outer kingdom, felicitous God-seeker of high dignity and exalted rank, may God increase his shadow's glory and ease his deeds. I have and will and have had the utmost personal love, the highest notional affection, perfect religious and worldly accord, and a unity of form and meaning. We are both one spirit blown into two forms, one soul come forth in two bodies. As my brother, the perfect Gnostic, has acquired complete benefit from knowledge of spiritual mysteries and ineffable fortune from divine truths, he has always conveyed to me truth-pointing utterances and described the spiritual states and stages of the great ones, the sheikhs and friends of God. May their secrets be sanctified.
This is beautiful. Has this book been translated, or this is just a passage you've translated?
This is a passage that I've translated, but Sunil Sharma is actually working on a translation of this and the Monasul Arba. So, hopefully you'll have kind of a nice volume that contains both of these works.
He had told me about the second one. He said he had done that and that he's working on another one. So I hope, yes, I do hope, because we do need to know more about what Jahanara herself wrote. There is this one question: is it possible to spin a story in the future about both women, both brothers going to war because of Udaipuri Mahal? How much ground exists for such a leap of examination? That is imagination. That is Mani Mugda's question.
Oh, I don't think so. It might be. I don't know what this movie is going to be about. This movie, I mean, so certainly it can be taken up by Bollywood by all means, but it would have very little ground in reality, because I think the stakes are actually greater, and I'm not so sure of this Udaipuri Mahal.
So the person who's written the script for Takht, I know him, and I've recommended your book to him also. I had told him, I said, make sure that you read Supriya's book, though, so hopefully he would have read it. I think he's a responsible person. Let's hope he makes the film is also a responsible film.
Yeah, so I look forward to it.
So one more question, because we've got how many times? We have 10 minutes, that's not a problem. Ali Nasir is asking, but I think you already discussed that. One hears very little of the women, Mughal women in the court. Did they ever wield any real power?
Well, I think that's something that I've kind of been discussing throughout the chat today. They absolutely did. Whether it was behind the scenes or not, they did wield power. They corresponded directly with political actors.
And I think you should also buy the book and read it, because in that you've given specific instances of Mumtaz Mahal's Mohar and the Nishan and all those things. So I don't know whether is your book available in Pakistan?
I wish. It's so sad, but the Indian edition can't go to Pakistan. So the American edition is available, but that is almost $30. So it's just, it costs more when translated into Pakistani rupees. The Indian edition would be more affordable, but it really is a tragedy. We at least through Instagram and things like this, we have we're able to connect. Even if we can't cross the borders, we can connect like this. But I would love for there to be just more movement of books and people.
Because this question, I think, if I'm not wrong, has come from Pakistan. Manu is asking, you have used unseen Persian material. Do you plan to do a full translation of a text yourself, and which one, if so?
I would love to translate texts. So one kind of logistical challenge is that in the American Academy, in universities here, to keep your job or to get tenure, to be promoted, you have to publish certain things that count. And unfortunately, it's many administrations of universities do not look too kindly upon translation. That for some reason, this kind of scholarship is not, very, very valued. So one can do it, after one achieves a certain level or after retirement or, so on, if one doesn't have to worry about, a university job to pay one's bills. But if you have a university job, it's not always easy to do that and have that become. There are lots, so one of the texts that was really valuable to my research is the Nuskha-e-Ahval-e-Shahi, by Tawakkul Beg, which is an unofficial chronicle of the relationship of the imperial family to Mullah Shah. And it was done by someone who's both an imperial servant as well as someone related to Mullah Shah. So it gives you this fantastic sort of little micro-history of how the life of this formerly aloof Sufi Pir changed, how he became more entrenched in the royal family. So he sort of became sort of domesticated in a way. And the imperial family too, had this close relationship with this particular Qadri circle. You hear references to people who are not prominent enough to be in the official circle, and you have unofficial stories, things that are too scandalous to mention in the chronicles, and so on. So that would be an amazing thing to translate. But and I had notes on it and stuff. But it's that it is a problem. And another problem is just finding a good publisher and a market for translations of Persian material.
So if you write a book, Supriya, I'm sure there will be the translation, there'll be many people in India who will be willing to publish. So please do go ahead and translate, even if it takes a long time, because I knew you're working on your other book. Can you just talk us, if it's okay with you, to your next project?
Sure. So the project I'm working on now it takes me sort of to a slightly later historical period. I also use Persian and Urdu material. This story is really an intellectual history of modern Hinduism. It's an intellectual history of a kind of strain of modern Hinduism, and it's something it's fairly contested among scholars. What was the role of colonialism in shaping Hinduism and sort of making Hinduism into a modern religion? And one of the ways to look at this is to look at the Indo-Persian tradition, because Persian was kind of a bridge between the pre-colonial and the colonial. It was the first language that was used as a language of administration, as a language of producing knowledge. There were codifications of Hindu law, Islamic law, the Puranas, and so on. So this is the book about modern Hinduism that looks at Persian and Urdu and what happened when people stopped using Persian. And you can actually see some unexpected links. Some people who might be sort of proto-Hindu nationalist figures who are still accessing these Mughal translations, such as the ones that Dara Shukoh did via Persian.
So that sounds very exciting. We've got just 30 seconds left. Thank you, Supriya, so much for joining us, taking out time. I know you have a very busy schedule. And thank you, everybody who has joined us and has, for your questions, for joining us, for being here. And all the best for the next project. And
thank you so much.
It sounds exciting, and I think something which we need, because these are the kind of conversations, the kind of books, especially from scholars like you, which are needed today to demystify a lot of things which are happening. So look forward to that.
Thank you. Lovely to see you today.
Same here. And we will be off any minute now. So thank you, and bye-bye. All the